All right. Excuse me. Welcome back, guys. Last week of school. So we're going to end with World War II and kind of the ending of that. And possibly, I'm still in the works of creating all the assignments. Possibly, maybe do a little bit about the Cold War. But it won't be much at the most. It might just be a quick little video at the end of one of our video notes. Okay, let's jump in. We're going to talk about the war ends. This is chapter 25, section 5. Here we go. Battle of Hedro. So, where we left off was basically D-Day, where the Great Britain forces and the American forces landed on the beaches of Normandy. There was 4 or 5 different beaches, and Omaha was the hardest for the Americans to get through. After they are through, they are inside Normandy, around Normandy Beach, but they still have to get farther into France. And what is so hard is there's been, before the war, a lot of farms were around that area, and in order to keep crops in certain areas and cattle in certain areas, they had these hedgerows. And if you look at this picture, it looks like a mound of dirt, a row of dirt. This is called a hedgerow. It is dirt walls, several feet thick, with covered in shrubbery. Okay. Well, this was so good for the Germans because they were able to hide behind these and be used as defense. So it was hard for the Americans and the British to get too deep into France because of all this defensive hedgerows that the Germans can use. So after the battle, they call it the Battle of Hedgerows, and basically, in order for them to get through, on July 25th, 1944, 2,500 American bombers flew over this area and basically bombed holes in these walls in order for the Americans to get through. So after they get through this defense of the Germans, they're able to really get into France itself, and this is where they are able to liberate France and also the Low Countries and move into invade Germany. But on August 25th, Paris is liberated, and 3 weeks later, Allied forces are only 20 miles from the German border. And 20 miles from the German border is where they're going to be stopped because this is where the Battle of the Bulge is going to happen. Literally, the Battle of the Bulge is the last German offensive, defense. I mean, after this, the Americans are basically just going to start rolling through Germany, and it won't be long, and the war is going to be over. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Battle of the Bulge. My grandpa, his name was Herman Morth. His nickname was Skip, but he was in charge of an artillery group. And he came over, and he came in about 6 or 7 days after D-Day. And he saw his major role was in the Battle of the Bulge. He was in charge of an artillery group. He was a staff sergeant or whatever. I forgot his title. But he was in charge. There are some stories where they were under attack and they were fleeing for cover, and his buddy jumped underneath a food wagon or some type of cart for cover, and my grandpa decided not to go underneath there, but he went down a ways more, and he finds out that next thing you know, that area where his buddy is underneath that cart, there was an explosion there, and his buddy died. So that was one of the stories that I heard from my mom that she heard from my grandpa. That just it's interesting to think of just some decisions, quick decisions, can be life or death, especially in war. But let's look at here. Okay, so the Battle of the Bulge. It starts out with this little. It's very hard to see, but this little town called Bastogne, and the idea was basically what happened is it's a little American. Uh, Americans are in this town, but it happens to get overran by or surrounded by Nazis. Okay, so this area, this was the line at first. Okay, this was the line. This line was American British. This side was Nazis. The Nazis are able to push a bulge into the line. Hence the name, the Battle of the Bulge. So this is the bulge, okay? So the Nazis have American forces surrounded at the town of Bastogne. And the German officer calls for the Allied forces to surrender, okay? So when and they call for surrender, but the commander A.C. McAuliffe sends this note, and it says something about oh my gosh, where it goes. He said something about nuts, like tough nuts. And I think you've probably heard that before, tough nuts. And it means not doing it. You know what? It's not happening. That would be kind of our American slang. But the Germans didn't understand what nuts meant, and they were saying, Nuits, was ist das? That means, what is this? What does nuts mean? They didn't get it at all, and Colonel Harper said, if you don't understand it, it means go to hell. Basically, as you can take that as far as you want, but he's saying, it's not happening, we're not surrendering, and you know what? Let's go. The Americans are able to get out of Bastogne. They weren't overran by any means. They let the town go to the Nazis, but they were able to get out. Even though the Allied line was pushed back, bulged into France, it did not break, and Germany was eventually defeated. And that was when we really did a flooding into the Americans into Germany. After Bastogne, the fighting lasted 3 more weeks. Germans lost more than 100,000 casualties and about 70 Americans. Germans lost about 100,000 casualties, and Americans lost about 75,000. Let's head on here. FDR, during this time, FDR also dies. April 12th, 1945, he suffers from a stroke. Kind of sad, but FDR is not going to be able to see the end of the war in Europe or in the Pacific. And his vice president, Harry Truman, takes over. Actually, Roosevelt was in his, he was vacationing in a home where there was this home was where for warm springs, springs that were warm. He was he liked to go sit in those springs because of his polio. It felt good on his muscles. And during that time, this last time is when he passed away. So after what's going on now is so April 12th, 1945, he dies. So he's able to see D-Day. He's able to see D-Day, which was the year prior, June prior. He was able to see the Battle of the Bulge, which was in December. So he's being able to see the success that the Americans and the British are having in Europe. So April 12th is when he dies. Now, April 29th is the end of April is when the Americans and the Russians really get to Berlin. Okay, so between the Battle of the Bulge and April, Americans and Soviets are just plowing through Europe. They're going through. The Americans are coming from the west through France and Germany, and the Russians are coming from Poland and Czechoslovakia through that area and into Russia, into Germany, and their goal was to get right at the end, right in the middle, and hit Berlin. Well, the end of April is when this kind of happens. Um, Hitler has seen this. Hitler sees this, and before this happens, he decides to marry his longtime mistress, Eva Braun. And then, as it comes closer, they realize that this is the end. And on April 30th, they both commit suicide with cyanide capsules and gunshots. Um, they were in this underground bunker, but they knew that it probably wasn't foolproof and they would be found. Before this happens, Hitler he chose his Grand Admiral Karl Donitz. I'm not sure how you would pronounce that, to be his successor. The officers, after they died, burned their bodies to prevent allies from taking his body, and his propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels also committed suicide along with his family. Now, I don't know. I'm kind of a guy that I don't know if I necessarily believe in all conspiracy theories, but I always find them interesting and entertaining. There's a lot of conspiracy theories out there if Hitler actually died that day. The one that probably has the most believers, or maybe some kind of evidence, whether it be pretty shaky, is that he went down to, I believe, Argentina, because that was kind of where some of these, a lot of German Nazis fled, was to South America, because there was some pockets of Nazi sympathizers. And the idea is some people believe that he was able to flee and he lived the rest of his life down in Argentina. Whether that's right or not, I am not exactly sure. So that was the fate of Hitler. Now, May 8th, so that's April 30th, so 8 to 9 days later, it is VE Day. And V stands for victory, and E stands for day. And this is May 8th, 1945. Soviet and American armies met in Germany. The Soviets took control of Berlin, and Germany surrendered unconditionally. Now, FDR knew, and the Americans and the Great British knew, and we talked a little bit about this when I talked about the Holocaust. They knew that Germany was doing bad things. They didn't realize it until they were actually going through Europe, when they saw the atrocities, especially the Russians, because a lot of those concentration camps were on the Russian side, or on the eastern side. But FDR did state that due to these atrocities, the Germans were going. He said that the Germans will suffer from multiple war crimes. We're going to stop there for this is the Europe portion. When we have reached victory in Europe, it is VE Day, May 8th, 1945, and Germany has surrendered. And as you can see, there's a picture there of the Americans right here. And it could be great. It could be British. It could be anybody. It could be people in London or New York, but they are celebrating because Europe, the Nazis have been defeated. When we start next time, we will be doing the Pacific realm, and we'll be talking about General MacArthur, island hopping, and ultimately the atomic bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.